Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. I'm Jordan Arocha here with Kevin Hardy. Today we're going to be looking at the new Silverado EV. We're going to do a hoist review, so we've got it up. We've got some of the aero shields off, but before we get started, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to Andrew, who's one of the folks watching Munro Live, was kind enough to reach out on the website and said, hey guys, if you want, I'll bring my truck and you guys can take a look at it, do a few videos. And so just want to extend our gratitude to Andrew for bringing the truck out. So thanks, Andrew. But with that being said, we'll start at the front of the vehicle here. We'll walk through some of the things that we're seeing underbody, things that we find interesting or what have you. So let's get into it. Kevin, why don't you get us started on the front end here?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell. So, obviously, unlike the Lightning, this is, and like the Hummer, all new BEV architecture. The Lightning shares a lot in common with its ICE counterpart as far as body on frame, more specifically, essentially split bumper and upper grille fascia and headlight trim. We can't really tell, but so you have lower AGS, upper AGS. Ideally, you'd want to actuate this, from a cost perspective with one actuator, but you may not need that, or you might need to be able to close and open both these separately. We can't really tell. And we're not taking Andrew's vehicle any further apart than what it already is. But it does have upper AGS and lower AGS and is actively essentially guiding air in and around the side curtains as well.
Yeah, the one thing that I depending on how you look at it, it's good and it's bad. There's a lot of texture, there's a lot of breakup at the front end of the vehicle. But one thing that I think they're doing well is they're hiding things like the forward-facing radar quite well, right? It just kind of blends into the whole theme and scheme of the front end of the vehicle. But in doing all those different textures and the different character lines throughout the front end of this grille, they're able to really obscure a lot of things, right? So if I point out a couple, we've got the radar, which I had already mentioned. AGS, you've got two separate sections of louvers behind there. We've got ultrasonic sensors for park distance. We've got cameras. We've got lights, we've got diverters going around the side here, right, to really wrap that wheel envelope from an aero perspective and get that slipstream going past those wheels. So a lot going on here, but it does not look overly messy, right? They've really done a good job at blending a lot of things into the front end of this vehicle. That being said, being black, that also helps, right? It kind of just brings everything together.
Yeah, no offense, Andrew. I wish it was, for our own perspective, a different color, just the grills. I'd like to know if these are separate parts. Is it one piece that's being painted and brought in? Painted components drive a lot of cost, especially if you're sequencing them for grills and various things of that nature. So hopefully these are all one piece behind, and there's a substrate that goes across your leading edge of the fascia. This way you're not sequencing multiple parts. But yeah, it's looks overall, it's pretty good to me. So. Yeah. From what we can tell.
Going underbody though, Munro is constantly looking for, right, lean design attributes, which is like design for assembly, design for manufacturing, how to simplify the front end of a vehicle. I'm seeing just a few telltales on the front end of this vehicle that are likely assembly process driven, right? The sequence in which different modules come into the vehicle at which point in time throughout the assembly process. But there's a lot of individual piece parts here in order to just kind of get the front clip of this vehicle closed out. So like these little wheel spats, these lips right here to again help from an aero perspective, being separate from the wheel liner, being separate from these two plastic pieces here, which then have an aero cover that goes over the top of all of this. There's a lot of parts going on, whereas a lot of other OEMs in this area are tying in the same molding process, these wheel lips with the lower valance, for example, or bringing these two pieces as one piece, or better yet, taking the lower aero shield on the front end of the vehicle and making that one piece that's really closing out this whole section. So guaranteed there's reason for this, right? There's probably a sequence that's driving some of this. We'd have to further take the vehicle apart to observe that. But there is a fair number of parts on the front end of this vehicle from a plastics perspective.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't see too much. We like to talk about crash. It's a heavy vehicle. And just from what we can see, and frankly, I can't remember too well, even from the Hummer when we had one in, about what they're doing for small overlap. rigid barrier or anything like that as far as managing energy. But you can see a little bit, as we look through just at the rail here, so that the cradle is obviously largely a stamped, clamshelled, and welded steel assembly. And you might be able to see potentially here on camera, but maybe not. Essentially, this is a one single stamp piece, but we have a Tailor welded blank here for this particular panel as it overlays on the outside. So this outer C here. The inner is not. So this rail is going, or this material is like monogamous, if you will, running all the way forward. So who knows? They may be trying to get a softer material, a little bit harder material, or just manage the energy a particular way. But one thing we don't get to see a lot of it on this particular vehicle, I do really like about a lot of the GM just body structures in general. They do a lot of castellation, a lot of scalloping. They're not really afraid of like MIG welding and one-sided assembly operations. So right here you see spot welds on the outer portion, and then as soon as you go in on that inner side, you have MIG welding. So in general, we see a lot more in common with when you look at some of the newer GM body structures with what the Pacific OEMs have been doing for a long time. They like bolts. They have no problem running in fasteners to bring various aspects of body structure together. This being essentially your Asian OEMs, and they will use a lot of MIG welding and one-sided assembly operations. It does open yourself up to a lot more freedom, but the plants sometimes hate it. Right? There's a lot of environmental considerations with MIG welding, but from an assembly perspective, it does give you a lot of advantages. And we see, and we'll talk about a little later, there's a ton of one-sided laser welding assembly operations through the battery pack as it goes through.
Absolutely. Maybe on the front end here, a quick mention for those NVH folks out there, from the EDM or the drive module perspective, the steering rack, a lot of the major monuments in the front end of this vehicle, they're all isolated to the cradle, which, as Kevin was mentioning, is largely stamped steel, MIG welded assembly, bolted to the vehicle. And the cradle is all hard mounted. So when I say isolated versus hard mounted, isolated, I'm saying there's a elastomeric, sometimes fluid filled, sometimes a hydro mount, something other. These are likely just a molded elastomeric mount right here, isolating the metallic portions together. So steering rack housing to the cradle. And likewise for the EDM going to the cradle, they're isolating all those as well. So from an overall front end of vehicle noise generator perspective and NVH perspective, they're really attacking a lot of those modes via the whole cradle assembly. So the cradle's your fixed monument to the body, and then they're isolating all those noise generators via that one layer of isolation to the cradle.
One thing I do think is interesting, so on the front part of the cradle here, so they have one large stamping, and this comes up to the top, so it's a clamshell across the section height is extremely tall. Yeah, this one here. And then essentially you have another clamshell where the suspension, is mounting to, and then we have another kind of stack of material here with a sleeve. So you have a slip plane here for Z height. It's fixed in the back, so it can get some adjustment here. But I do think, with this one piece of material going all the way across, and how tall the section height is, there's a lot of strength there, and we kind of see some asymmetric. Actually, not really. It's just mostly the isolator on the side for the drive module. But it's a lot of times you'll see on some cradles, this gets spindly and you see a lot of layering of material, and it kind of ends up looking like a patchwork of components to get strength. But they've brought in a very simple large section all the way across, and then essentially have layered within each. So it just something small of note,
Yeah, I think I agree. And then the other thing to point out is the Tailor welded section. So on the rail, right, one of the major load paths of the front end of the truck, right here, it's difficult to make out, but there's a little line in the body structure where I'm trying to indicate with the laser. That is a Tailor welded blank. And so Tailor welded blanks are used for one or two or perhaps both reasons to change either the material grade and or the thickness, or sometimes both. And I find it interesting that coincides spatially very closely with the front end of this hard mounted cradle. So it could be that from a joint strength or stiffness perspective, they wanted to get a different reaction right at that cradle mount. Could be from an impact perspective, could be from a stiffness perspective, hard to say. But I do find it oddly coincidental that it's right around that primary cradle mount on the front end of the vehicle. As Kevin mentioned, it's tough to see the front end, so to really understand the full sorb script from the front end of the vehicle back. But that was one thing where for Tailor weather blanks, typically we don't see them that far forward on the rail. We see them on a rail periodically, that's not super surprising, but to go that far forward is not typically the norm.
So, we obviously have covered the drive modules. I believe they're very, very similar as far as just their GM's overall Ultium, lineup for both battery packs and then drive modules. But one thing we talked about then, and I do like about the Silverado and the Hummer EV. So it does have a park pawl, right? But the actuators here for the park pawl assembly itself, but it's on the front drive module. So the nice thing about that is, there's kind of a mechanical interface there within your drive module, and it piggybacks off of your electronic parking brake in the rear. So essentially, you're locking all, both drive axles of the vehicle itself, whether you're towing, more than you're supposed to be, or whatever often happens in the truck world, or on just very steep grades. If you were to have a power failure or anything like that, it gives you some redundancy on both axles, right? So you'll already have the brakes clamped in the rear, and essentially the front axle locked as well. With that. And frankly, there's lots of conversations with lots of our customers about park pawls and whether or not they need to be there. But on trucks, it's hard. In every conversation I've been a part of, it really is hard to get away from it, just because of the weight concern with towing and trailers, and more specifically, I think just overloading. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a real risk that the OEMs pay for, right? Just to protect usage down the line for the customers. So
well, and the point, it's not just an EV issue, right? That's a ICE vehicle issue, or not an issue, but it's something that we're trying to solve, right? It's a big cost to the OEM, right? So in the spirit of overall cost reduction, it's something that, to your point, we're trying to take out. But yeah, it's not specific to EVs, but also uniquely in the EV space, we're seeing folks like Tesla start to take those out of the vehicles completely, to rely on electronic parking brakes, so that the brakes are doing the work of what the park pawl would ordinarily do, right? Yep.
Just in general, right, for the suspension, you have a short long arm setup in the front, castings for both your upper control and lower. Jordan was kind of pointing out, just if you look from the backside, a lot of section in the upper control arm, given in part to where your stay bar link is running up on the backside and connecting to. But a big contrast, obviously, to the Cybertruck being essentially a deep drawn single piece stamping. But everything you can see, just the mass of the truck, right? As far as the strut, kind of the J horn around to the lower control arm, the bushing can and the bolt. This is kind of interesting. It looks like unfortunately, Andrew lost a bolt. This should be, I believe, located here and fastened here like the other side. And we could probably help you out, at least a zip tie to keep this from moving around on your way home. And at least control the brake and the brake on where it's moving. But again, large vehicle, it's very heavy, and you can see just how that scales for the bushings, the ball joints, everything is large, doubled up on essentially the brake caliper mounts. So
the brake caliper, to your point, Kevin, that's one thing that really stood out to me, because when you look at the size and the magnitude, for folks out there who are into racing or anything like that, at first blush, the caliper is so large and tall on the Z-axis, like top to bottom in vehicle position. My initial, I'm like, oh, fixed calipers, but then immediately you see slides, you see a separate brake bracket and a caliper. So it's a floating caliper system, but to have two, at least, I'm guessing at least M12, maybe M14 or something bolts on each side of the caliper is incredibly substantial. So it really just speaks to, everyone likes to say, well, they're EVs, they use regen, for braking, so on and so forth. Well, the brake package still needs to be able to manage the full GVWR of the vehicle, right? So it's kind of a false positive when people are like, well, you're not using your brakes as much. It's true from a usage and a maintenance perspective, but from a safety perspective, they still need to do the full job.
Sure. And you carry the weight, right? The weight
Right.
begets the weight as far as the brakes are concerned.
That's right. Yep.
As we move backwards to the very large, 200 kilowatt hour pack. One thing that's interesting, we were talking about the one-sided laser weld. So here you can see essentially the little kind of double wishbones going across. I don't even know if we cut apart the Hummer pack completely, if we completely disassembled the housing. A little bad on me, but I had a different part of that project, and I'm just not sure, to be honest. But you can see through various parts of it, some adhesive and sealant going through. Hopefully they're doing dollops across the way, so they're not doing one continuous bead from just a material usage perspective. But it's kind of hard to tell from here. It is pretty continuous as far as what we can see oozing out between the seams. But essentially the battery has, I don't know, we've been calling it kind of the structural wafer, as far as a skid plate going across it. You can kind of see from some of the sides a little bit of the structure. Let's see, maybe we'll come back here, Eric, a little bit. It's a little bit easier to see some of the structure that we have here, protecting the lower portion of the battery pack. So you can just see lots of layering of material. The gauge itself is relatively thin on the outer portion. And then like where these two major joints and a lot of these fasteners run across, securing a battery pack, it looks, I'm not sure if it's a roll form or not. It could be. Could just be a series of layered stampings. Let's see, this one is going back on itself. So I think this might be a roll form that's brought back onto itself, which is nice because you get a lot of complex shape, and a lot of these cuts can be done on the line itself. So as the rollers are forming, and it's just a flat piece of metal, and these rollers start bending up and forcing the component in on itself, down at the end of the line, you can have a laser cutting cell cutting out some of that stuff. So it all comes out, cut the length for the most part. And it's relatively efficient from that perspective, depending on how many rollers you have on that cell. But
yeah, and the whole thing is really like what you were saying before, that Pacific OEM. I remember the GM Alpha platform came out, right? I think it's Gen 6 Camaro, yes, with the ATS and CTS Cadillac twins on there. And we saw a lot of really, really scalloped steel, right, where they're kind of carving out material wherever they can. A lot of extra little piece parts, a lot of welding, very similar to here. I liken this pack, it's like a much grander, larger version of what we saw on a Mitsubishi Outlander, right? So it's just a lot of E-coated, stamped, welded together steel. But it's thin, and for what it is, there's a lot of good properties of it. Strength, good packaging space, right? You don't need a big casting, which is going to be larger in whichever dimension you happen to cast it in. So pros and cons, but they are definitely shifting in that direction, it seems. GM, that is.
Yeah, and I'd like to know if it was built in a more conventional domestic style, how much more it may weigh, right? I mean, spot welds, laser welding, all this stuff isn't free per se, but when you down gauge all this material, regardless of what the part looks like in terms of shape, you're buying the blank, for it, and that all costs money, and frankly, weight as well. So sometimes it's nice to be able to have that trade-off of a lot of smaller tools, smaller presses, and more assembly time, labor, and cells to balance out the weight of the vehicle. And this is relatively thin, and you can kind of see there might have been some, at least in the plant, some material damaging, handling issues, on the line here. But it does also look like it's, stamped. That might even be galvanized and then E-coated afterwards. But
so maybe moving a little bit further rearward in vehicle, just like the Hummer that we saw before, and on the Cybertruck, for example, this one is equipped with the all-wheel steering. So we can see that steering rack system up here, right? So it's front steer, but on the rear axle, if that makes sense. And for the lower control arms, right away, these guys kind of stick out at you. If you look at this in contrast to a Lightning, for example, so about as comparable as trucks could be, Lightning, from Ford versus the GM Silverado EV. The Lightning did a really, really large cast aluminum lower control arm. This is a clamshell steel. So cost per pound, the steel is going to be a benefit. There's in some cases some strength benefits, not necessarily stiffness benefits, right? Those are different attributes. But I just do find it interesting that for a heavier vehicle, These are some of the things that we're seeing. This is driving likely weight in the vehicle. And you might say, well, no wonder it's 1,000 pounds more. The odd thing is when you start to look at steel versus cast aluminum, or you start to look at these trade-offs, specifically in suspension components, your weight benefit is not as much as you would think it would yield. So going to steel, some of the most weight efficient suspension systems in aggregate that we've seen in past have been from like Asian Pacific OEMs, like a Honda Pilot, for example. They're real lightweight, they're single clamshell steel control arms and links, especially in the rear, similar to what we saw in the front upper control arm on the Tesla. So just because you go aluminum or the cast aluminum might look cooler, right, doesn't necessarily mean they're better, right? We'd have to dismantle all this and get weights and really understand a little bit more about this before we'd make a call like that. But more food for thought, right? If you happen to be designing suspension systems and looking at these, it's not just, oh, they went steel, so clearly this was the goal, right? There's a lot of attributes to take into account here.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, the Hummer is a stamped clamshell and welded, and they're aluminum, if I remember correctly.
The Hummer, yeah, I'd be tough to
long.
quote on that one. Yeah,
it's so long ago. So, obviously a more premium vehicle, there's a little bit more money on the table, or maybe, and it'd be nice to see a newer Hummer, same model year, same production. We could have seen a reversion going away from aluminum into steel from a cost saving perspective. But I mean, obviously it's extremely large, stampings and complex shapes like this. It's all one piece for the lower, one piece for the top. I don't see anything else being stitched together. But, when you look at it, all this material kind of in between here and reaching out this way, this was one big flat, relatively speaking, these kind of get nested together, but these kind of complex shapes and dives do drive essentially a lot of costs, right? Just getting, and I mean, you want this ideally to have in some ways less parts, but coming out to grab these features drive a significantly larger blank size. So sometimes, to Jordan's point, right, sometimes your castings, even in aluminum, can be less costly because you're essentially 95% material efficient. You might lose a little bit of material in the runner going out to the casting. Where here we have, off-fall from the stamping itself, which you can sell as scrap, but you still bought it. You bought it in the beginning, and then the scrap value itself does not necessarily offset the material price that you paid for in the beginning. So,
right. Yeah, absolutely. Just talking real quickly on sort of the design for assembly, the lean design methodology that we're talking about. There's definitely an assembly function here with the lower control arm. So you're seeing right here, they're opening up a hole in this lower control arm here and here. That's for through bolt access for the shock mount coming to this lower control arm. But the trade-off to opening up this hole here is that they had to add a little cover, right? So that they're not just taking in stones, dirt, what have you, getting in that orifice, corroding, right? Creating some more noise, so on and so forth. It's not atypical to see little shields like this, right? Sometimes folks will put it on, not just from an aero perspective, but from a stone pecking perspective to protect the paint, to keep it from corroding too quickly and so forth. But, you can see in the range numbers with the Silverado, starting at the front with the AGS, the attention to detail around the wheel envelopes, the wheel spats in the front, these little
they're just like die cut. I love
die
them,
cut,
right?
yeah.
There's probably a long piece of extruded material cut into shape and then stuck on.
Yeah, this is about as simple as it gets. It's not necessarily, I'll say, eloquent, but it is certainly about as simple as it gets. Two-stage push pin, a die cut piece of, some sort of elastomeric material. I don't know if it's TPO or EPDM. I'm not seeing the carats, but from the front to the rear, and especially now closing out the back end of the vehicle, you really see the attention to detail on aero and how they're really trying to cover everything up to help counteract that weight, to counteract some of that rolling resistance that they're getting from an aero perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you can omit a cell and then have a bunch of aero features, maybe make up half the difference, essentially, of the material cost of that cell, you can spend a lot, and I mean a lot of money on aero and potentially even active aero to get, for your performance from a range perspective where you need to be. That just how much, you know, essentially the battery costs are. That said, I mean, they've leveled out to, I think, below pre-pandemic levels. So that coupled with more battery capacity coming online should be interesting from material cost perspectives in these batteries.
Right. Yeah, that's a big portion of the trade-off. Battery kilowatt hours that you need to maintain in the vehicle from a storage and range perspective is a massive function, and you're trading that off with piece costs every step of the way. Whereas in an ICE vehicle, you're still doing that, but I'll say when you're in the conversations at the OEM level, a lot of the conversations are surrounding, you know, is it going to hit the window sticker? What is the mileage, right? Miles per gallon that the customer is going to see. Because there's not as much of this range anxiety function that sort of comes into play with ICE vehicles, it's more of a function of the window sticker, right? Like, what is my mile per gallon efficiency? Which you might say, yes, that translates to range. But because of the cost per unit energy or kilowatt hour in the batteries and the trade-off that you can make with range in terms of a reductive approach to getting those out of the vehicles, OEMs are willing to spend money on all these covers to get batteries out of the vehicle while not observing a range reduction.
But no, I mean, it's very, very similar, obviously, to the Hummer. Yep. The range and, you know, a lot of media publications, frankly, it speaks for itself. It's pretty impressive. Yep. It is heavy. I mean, it's very heavy. There's no getting around that. But it's kind of this forced foray, you know. There's trucks are, you know, it's no secret, they're a high profit, you know, segment for manufacturers, a safe place to, I don't want to say play around with, but do some research development and see what comes of it, as then you could bring your technology and scale it down to less costly vehicles. Trucks are never a bad place to kind of put that time and money, you know, into it. So, but the range, right? You know, it's a struggling factor with the trucks and their capability and what a lot of people like to use with them. So it's a little bit of a dual-edged sword. So,
well, once again, just want to say thank you to Andrew again for bringing the truck out here. Next time, maybe he'll let us cut into it or something. I'm just kidding. We won't cut into your truck. But thank you again for letting us take a look at it. I hope we can get our hands on one to tear it down to answer some of those questions that I certainly have in looking at the underside of it. So until we catch you next time, please reach out to us if you're interested about more at sales@leandesign.com, and we'll catch you on the next video.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.